Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. On our first story for today, Nigeria's debt office has raised 2.2 trillion naira from its 300 billion Sukuk offer, showing strong investor interest with a 735% oversubscription. At the same time, the central bank is lowering interest rates. Meanwhile, a $5 billion oil-backed loan deal with Saudi Aramco has stalled due to falling oil prices and Nigeria's low oil production. What do these mean for Nigeria's future borrowing strategy and economic stability? Finally, Russia is strengthening its ties in the African continent with some African countries, mainly in security and trade. Its new group, the African Corps, have replaced the Wagner in Mali, helping fight Islamic militants. Some progress has been made, but threats from groups like the ISIS still remain. How will Russia's growing presence affect the region in the long run? Joining us today for further insights is Shehu Owojulube. Welcome, Shehu, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with our first story where we see Nigeria's Debt Management Office has been able to raise 2.2 trillion from a 300 billion Sukuk offer, and they're saying there is an oversubscription. So what factors do you think are contributing to the overwhelming investor interest in Nigeria's Sukuk, despite our economic uncertainties that we're facing the country?
Well, there are a number of factors responsible for the oversubscription we've seen. The first is that interest rates have been high in Nigeria several months. No, let me say several months, but over the past months, interest rates have remained high, meaning that investors were seeing a slightly more than decent return on investment. And so this Sukuk then offers investors who two things now. The Sukuk oversubscription can be credited or attributed to first investors who want to invest in ethical instruments, right? Because you know that certain religions or certain religious beliefs got one against investing in certain instruments. And so for Islamic investors, for example, they would prefer to invest in more ethical investment instruments, which the Sukuk is one of it. That's the first thing. And the second, interest rates have been high, and so investors can lock in on these high interest rates because it is anticipated or it is expected that the CBN will begin to reduce the interest rates as it achieves or as it ticks off things on its bucket list. And so the interest rates cannot remain high for the next 5 years, for example. At some point it will begin to reduce, and so people want to lock in and take advantage of the current high interest rate environment while make sure that they have a decent return on investment. Also, it would be good to mention that there's been a wave of financial literacy, personal financial literacy amongst Nigerians, and you have a lot of personal finance influencers who make videos on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, enlightening people and increasing awareness of the available financial instruments. And so people now understand that some of that petty cash can be channeled into certain investments.
I mean, that's really great that we have a lot of subscription, but do you think that this would this sends a strong signal to like kind of like a sustainable shift in Nigeria's borrowing strategy towards non-interest and infrastructure linked financing as well. Do you think that as part from like us borrowing all the time, is this also a way for us to like get more resources, kinda?
Well, for Nigeria, we have not been able to take advantage because of our economic situation. We have not been able to borrow as much externally as we would usually do, right? Because of our macroeconomic challenges, right? So it's that now we are simply taking advantage, or the government is simply taking advantage of the domestic investor demand while they work out what's while they make room or work out how to attract foreign investments. Because as we've said in recent times, as we've seen in recent times, it's foreign portfolio investment which is called hot money, because it can easily be withdrawn from the economy, that has moved into the economy much more than foreign direct investment, FDI, which is what we call patient capital. And so, because we have not been able to borrow as much externally, we've seen Nigeria move to or search for alternatives, such as the crude backed loan that we wanted to borrow, we intend to borrow from Saudi Arabia, and looking for long-term buyers of crude oil, right? And so because of that, it's very narrow. The likelihood and the possibilities for borrowing externally has been narrow, and so that's why the government is taking advantage, as it should, of the domestic investor demand.
I mean, and as you can see, there's a lot of demand for that as well. It's interesting that you mentioned, the Saudi issue that we're having, and that goes and also borrowing from external um, partners, basically, if I put it that way. So on to our second story, where we have a 5 billion loan backed by oil with the Saudi Aramco, where we're having a delay, largely due to the fall of oil prices globally, as well as our low oil production levels. How critical going forward was this oil-backed loan for Nigeria? I mean, if you look at our short-term fiscal needs, and what alternatives do you think that the government will consider in the light that this loan is being like delayed?
Well, the crude backed loan from Saudi Arabia, it's not Nigeria's first time. Neither will it be the last time of Nigeria trying to leverage its crude oil resources to attract the much needed forex, right? So, but in this case, the loan has been stalled, as you said, because of the low oil prices. And so it is much needed. In fact, Nigeria needs it because of our fiscal position right now. And you would see that the demand for FX has slightly cooled, but it remains, the foreign exchange rate still remains high at 1,600, around 1,600 to the dollar. And so that's an indication of the narrow room. So the government has very little wiggle room to maneuver. And so it has FX obligations to be met, right? There are loans to be serviced, there are international obligations and embassies to fund, you have investors who want to take out their money or invest their money. So we need to shore up our own external foreign reserves, right? So Nigeria needed that loan. And so yeah, that's what I can say. Nigeria needed that loan, and so the government will, in the interim, yes, I remember now, in the interim, the government may look out for long-term deals for crude oil to get into, and when we get upfront payments for later supply of crude oil to these dealers and marketers. So that's one of the options or alternatives that is open to the government, which I'm sure they're already exploring. But because, again, global demand for crude is not at its best levels, so there is very little that the government can do as regards that.
So going forward, do you think that our oil output also threatens Nigeria's ability to secure future resource-backed financing?
Certainly, because any entity, any country who will agree to a resource-backed loan in Nigeria would look at the numbers and would see, for example, that in the later years of the Buhari administration, crude oil production fell to below 1 million barrels per day from the days of the Jonathan administration, when it was as high as 2 million barrels per day, right? So the numbers have to make sense, to put it like that. The numbers have to make sense. And the fact that Nigeria has, although there's been efforts in recent times to bring it under control, but we have still not been able to rid ourselves of the pest called oil-borne crude oil theft. That still affects our production numbers, it affects our production levels. The conflict with host communities and pipeline sabotage also contributes to the low levels that we see currently. And so anyone who would give Nigeria a resource-backed loan, would look at the numbers and would want to be sure that Nigeria would be able to meet its obligations in the years ahead and still have some wiggle room to play around.
Sure, interesting. To our final story now. So, Russia is consolidating its presence in Africa, especially in Mali, where its new military units, the African Corps, have replaced the Wagner to support counter insurgency efforts. Um, could Russia's growing presence create new geopolitical risk or opportunity for African states grappling with insecurity? Why do you think there's also a growing presence or involvement of Russia on the African continent as well? And what do you see going forward? Do you see more countries facing insecurity, building partnerships with Russia, or staying away from Russia entirely?
Well, Russia is one of Africa's top arms exporters, and so it has deep ties with countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And we can see with the military leadership and their positioning tilting more towards Russia than the West. So Russia's presence is more of a political tactic and also a way of getting some resource concessions from African countries, right? So it's Russia is using this as leverage, as strategic leverage in African countries. Now, the precise role of this Africa Corps, Russia's Africa's Corps, as we're calling it, it's not very clear at the moment, but it suggests that it would still focus on regime security, which was what the Wagner group provided to the ruling junta in these countries, right? And it's also a way to maneuver and deflect criticism, right? Because people criticize Russia as saying that they want to simply take over from and simply displace the West in Africa and take over. So it's a way of deflecting and saying, well, we have left. The mission of the Wagner Group has been accomplished, and now we have handed over to the Africa Corps to take over from where the Wagner Group stopped, or to maintain the whatever successes that the Wagner Group has achieved. But we see clearly that the problems with the ISIS and the other terror groups remain. The threat of those terror groups remain in countries like Mali, where we have seen upsurge and sustained attacks by these terror groups on military facilities in the country. So, well, it's at the end of the day, Wagner's departure is simply, in my opinion, a ploy, a superficial ploy that leaves Mali and its neighbors in a web of foreign influence and instability, because Russia will continue to trade arms to Africa to ensure that its leverage remains, and at the same time it can simply deflect and say it has no plays no direct role in Africa's security.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Shay. That's all for today. I mean, it's always a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. To all our listeners, this podcast is powered by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. For deeper insights into our work, you can visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you for tuning into the week ahead. Join us next Friday for more updates shaping the African continent.